Most people see a badge and think of authority. I see it as a burden, a weight I carry to protect the innocent. But when I pulled into my driveway after a double shift, I didn't see a crime scene. I saw my 8-year-old daughter chained to a porch railing like an animal in 95-degree heat. Her heart monitor was screaming. Her lips were turning blue. And the woman who did it, she was standing across the street, smiling. She thought she was enforcing neighborhood rules. She didn't realize she had just signed her own death warrant in a court of law. My name is Robert Ramirez, and this is the day the HOA picked the wrong father to break. I had barely put my patrol SUV in park when a scream tore through the quiet street. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear when a kid scrapes a knee or loses a toy. It was a sound so raw, so terrified, that it didn't even register as human at first. It sounded like a soul being crushed. After a grueling 14-hour shift as the police chief of Lakewood County, all I wanted was to walk through my front door, smell the coffee, and hug my daughter Emma and my wife Jessica. I wanted to be a father, not a cop. But that scream, it froze every drop of blood in my body. "Daddy, Daddy, help." I didn't even bother to close the car door. I hit the pavement running, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I sprinted toward the porch, and what I saw almost dropped me to my knees. There, in the middle of our quiet American dream, was a nightmare I couldn't comprehend. My daughter, my 8-year-old Emma, born with a heart so fragile every single beat was a victory, was chained to our porch railing. A thick steel chain, heavy industrial grade, was cinched around her tiny waist, pulled so tight she could barely expand her lungs, and locked with a massive padlock. She was on her knees on the wooden boards, her face the color of a deep sunset, a sickly, deep red slick with sweat. The 95-degree heat was cooking her alive. Her lips were fatting from pink to a ghostly blue. Her chest heaved in shallow, desperate jerks as she gasped for air that wouldn't come. And then there was the sound. Her portable heart monitor was shrieked a warning tone that every parent of a heart-patient child learns to fear in their nightmares: distress, danger, collapse. "Emma," I screamed, dropping beside her, my hands shaking so violently I could barely touch her. "Baby, who did this? What happened?" She tried to lift her head, her eyes glassy and unfocused. "Daddy, can't breathe, it hurts." Her tiny fingers curled against her shirt, clutching right over the faded scar from her last open-heart surgery. Every second I sat there, her life was leaking out. Her breaths were shallow and panicked. Then the monitor's shriek grew louder, a continuous high-pitched wail. Her heart was beginning to give out. I grabbed the chain and yanked with all the strength I had, a father's desperation fueling my muscles. But it was solid steel, bolted through the heavy railing. I pulled until my hands burned and the skin tore, but it didn't budge. I reached for my radio, my voice an octave deeper with a cold, professional rage. "This is Chief Ramirez. Get an ambulance to my address now, and I need bolt cutters, move." Emma started crying, but she didn't have the strength to really let it out. Each sob was just cutting into her precious, dwindling oxygen. "Daddy," the lady, she said I was bad, she put the chains on me. "What lady, baby, who?" I leaned close, trying to be her anchor, trying to keep her from straining to speak. She whispered the name that made my world go black. "The HOA lady, Mrs. Harrington." My heart stopped for a beat. Diana Harrington, the president of our homeowners association, a woman who treated her neighborhood authority like oxygen and had made life miserable for half the people on this block. I knew she was a bully. I knew she was obsessed with curb appeal and rules. But I never imagined she was a monster. "Stay with me, Emma," I whispered, brushing the sweat off her forehead with a trembling hand. "Daddy's here, keep your eyes on me." But her eyelids fluttered, her breathing hitched one last time, and then she went limp in my arms. "No, no, Emma." "Stay with me." I laid her flat on the sun-baked wooden boards of the porch, her small, limp body looking impossibly fragile against the industrial steel that still bound her. My hands, which had handled high-speed chases and stared down armed suspects, were now trembling so violently I could barely find her pulse. I began CPR, the rhythm of the compressions echoing the frantic thudding in my own chest. 1, 2, 3, I counted out loud, my voice cracking. I was a police chief, trained for every crisis, but in this moment I was just a father watching his world go dark. I pressed down on her chest, counting the compressions through a blurred haze of hot tears. 30 beats, 2 breaths, 30 beats. Come on, sweetheart, don't leave me, not like this, not because of a chain. The front door flew open with a bang that sounded like a gunshot. My wife, Jessica, stepped out, a smile on her face that died the instant she saw the scene. Her scream split the air, a high-pitched sound of pure agony that I will never forget. Emma, oh God, Rob, what happened? Call 911 again? I barked, my voice raw. Tell them she's crashing, tell them the chief's daughter is down. Jessica dropped to the other side of Emma, her hands over her mouth, sobbing as she watched me fight for our daughter's life. My arms were burning, the lactic acid screaming in my muscles, but I couldn't stop. My vision was tunneling, focusing only on Emma's pale face and that horrific blue tint on her lips. The sound of sirens finally cut through the neighborhood, growing louder until the air vibrated with them. My patrol units arrived first, tires screeching as they swerved into the driveway. Officers Rodriguez and Quinn didn't wait for the cars to fully stop before jumping out. They saw me on the ground, saw the chain, and saw the desperation in my eyes. Quinn already had the bolt cutters in his grip. "Chief, move," Rodriguez shouted. I shifted just enough for Quinn to get the blades around the heavy steel link. With one sharp, metallic crunch, the chain that had been strangling my daughter's life force fell away. I didn't stop. I kept the CPR rhythm going even as the metal slid off her. The ambulance pulled up seconds later, the paramedics leaping out with bags and a defibrillator. They moved with a clinical speed that was both comforting and terrifying. They took over the compressions, their faces grim. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and pulled Jessica into my side as we watched them work. Then the words came, the words that shattered the last remains of my composure. No pulse, preparing epinephrine. I watched as they loaded her into the back of the rig, their hands never stopping that rhythmic pumping on her chest. They were fighting a war for her heart, and the enemy was winning. Jessica climbed in the back, her face a mask of grief. As the doors slammed shut and the ambulance roared away, I was left standing in the silence of my own driveway. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in sweat, dirt, and my daughter's fear. I looked at the broken chain lying on the porch like a dead snake, and that's when I saw her. Across the street, Diana Harrington was standing on her perfectly manicured lawn. She wasn't calling for help. She wasn't crying. She was standing there with her arms folded across her chest, watching the entire tragedy as if it were a television show she found mildly interesting. There was a nasty, smug calm on her face. Our eyes locked. I expected her to look away, to show some shred of human remorse. Instead, she did the unthinkable. She smiled. It was a slow, monstrous curling of her lips. She then turned on her heel and walked back into her house, closing the door behind her as if she had done nothing more significant than misplacing a piece of mail. Something inside me didn't just break, it rearranged. The panic was gone. The sorrow was pushed into a deep, dark corner. What was left was something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous than rage. It was a promise of total, absolute justice. "My name is Robert Ramirez," I whispered to the empty street, the words tasting like iron. "I am the police chief of Lakewood County, and you just made the biggest mistake of your life." The hospital hallway smelled of industrial cleaner and despair. I stood by the vending machine, not seeing it, my reflection in the dark glass looking like a man I didn't recognize. My uniform was wrinkled, stained with the sweat of the struggle to keep my daughter breathing. Inside the ICU, Lily was hooked up to a forest of machines. Every beep of the monitor felt like a hammer blow to my skull. I couldn't stay in that room for another second watching her chest rise and fall by the grace of a mechanical bellows. I needed to move. I needed to act. Because while the doctors were fighting to save her life, I knew I had a different job to do. I had to build a case that would bury Victoria Gable. I stepped outside into the cool night air and dialed Captain Vance. "Vance, tell me you've got something," I said, my voice a low growl. "Chief, it's worse than we thought," Vance replied, his tone unusually grim. "This wasn't a snap decision. We just finished talking to your neighbor, Mrs. Lynn." I listened as the details of the morning began to knit together into a tapestry of pure, unadulterated evil. According to Mrs. Lynn, who had watched the entire thing from her kitchen window with a trembling heart, Victoria hadn't just stumbled upon Lily on the porch. She had been waiting. Victoria Gable had been seen packing her own driveway since 9:45 a.m., clutching a designer tote bag as if it were a weapon. The moment my wife, Sarah, stepped inside to take that business call, Victoria moved with the precision of a predator. She didn't walk across the street. She stormed. "She was shouting at that poor girl before she even reached your grass," Vance said, reading from the preliminary report. "Lily tried to tell her. She told her about her heart. She showed her the monitor. She told her she was allowed to be there." But Victoria didn't care about the truth. She told my 8-year-old daughter that she was a liability to the neighborhood's image. She said that sickly children shouldn't be seen from the street because it lowered property values. And then she reached into that bag. She hadn't found that chain in our garage. She didn't find it on the street. She had brought it from her own home, already measured, already prepared with a heavy-duty padlock. She wrapped it around Lily's waist while my daughter cried, begging her to stop, telling her she couldn't breathe in the heat. Victoria told her to stop pretending to be sick and quit the drama, Vance continued, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. Then she locked the chain to the railing, pocketed the key, and walked away while Lily started to collapse. Mrs. Lynn had tried to help. The poor woman, 80 years old and frail, had hurried across the street, but she couldn't even lift the heavy padlock, let alone break the chain. She was the one who called 911 while Victoria stood on her own porch, watching the elderly woman struggle, not lifting a finger to help. "And there's more, Chief," Vance added. "We got a warrant for her phone. We found a text she sent to the HOA Vice President just 5 minutes after she chained Lily up." "Read it," I commanded. "It says, finally going to teach the Miller family a lesson. Their sick kid needs to learn she's not special. Problem solved." A cold, heavy stillness settled over me. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a lapse in judgment. This was premeditated. This was a woman who had looked at a dying child and saw nothing but a nuisance to be removed. "Vance," I said, my voice as sharp as a razor, "I'm recusing myself from the arrest. I want you to take a full tactical team. I want the lights, I want the sirens, and I want her in handcuffs in front of every neighbor on that street." "You got it, Chief," he replied. "We're moving out now." I hung up the phone and looked back at the hospital doors. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was the law, and the law was coming for Victoria Gable. The night air in our neighborhood usually smelled of freshly cut grass and jasmine, but tonight it felt heavy with the scent of ozone and impending justice. I stood at the edge of my driveway, a shadow among shadows, watching as the blue and red strobe lights began to flicker against the white siding of the houses down the block. I had recused myself from the arrest to ensure the case was airtight, but I couldn't look away. I needed to see the moment the crown fell off Victoria Gable's head. Captain Vance didn't go in quiet. He led a full tactical team, 3 cruisers and a transport unit, their sirens giving a short, sharp yelp as they pulled up in front of Victoria's pristine, 2-story colonial. This wasn't because Victoria was a physical threat. She was a middle-aged woman in a silk robe, but because the community needed to see the weight of the law descending on a monster. The neighborhood, once silent, began to stir. Front porch lights flickered on one by one. Neighbors stepped out onto their lawns, their faces illuminated by the rhythmic pulse of the police lights. They watched in a stunned, collective silence as Vance marched up to her front door and hammered on it. When the door finally opened, Victoria Gable stood there, looking more annoyed than afraid. She adjusted the lapel of her robe, her eyes scanning the officers with a look of pure aristocratic disdain. "This is absurd," she snapped, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "I was simply enforcing HOA rules regarding unsupervised minors and property liability. You are trespassing on private property." Vance didn't blink. He reached out, grabbed her wrist, and spun her around toward the doorframe with a practiced, fluid motion. The metallic click-clack of the handcuffs locking into place was the most beautiful sound I had heard all day. "Victoria Gable," Vance said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed my own thoughts. "You are under arrest for aggravated child endangerment, unlawful restraint of a minor, and attempted murder." Victoria let out a sharp, mocking scoff. "Attempted murder? Over that little machine she wears? I thought that was for attention. You can't arrest someone for clearing a nuisance off a porch." The crowd of neighbors gasped. The coldness of her words seemed to drop the temperature of the entire street. "You saw her heart monitor, Victoria," Vance said, his grip tightening just enough to make her wince. "Multiple witnesses confirm it. You knew she was sick, and you shackled her in 95-degree heat anyway." As they led her down the driveway toward the waiting cruiser, the silence of the neighborhood finally broke. It started with a single voice, Mr. Henderson from 3 doors down, whose wife Victoria had once threatened to sue over her oxygen tank. "About damn time," he shouted. Then others joined in. The families she had bullied, the people she had fined into poverty over the height of their grass or the color of their curtains, they all stood there, watching their tormentor being pushed into the back of a police car. Victoria looked back once, her eyes searching for a friendly face, someone to defend her authority. She found nothing but cold, hard stares. She was no longer the president of the HOA. She was a defendant in a felony case. I watched the cruiser pull away, its taillights fading into the distance. But the victory felt hollow, because back at the hospital the real battle was still being fought. While Victoria was headed to a jail cell, my daughter was still fighting for every single breath. I looked at my phone, a text from Sarah, "Rob, the doctor is coming out, get here now." My heart hammered against my ribs as I sprinted back to my SUV. The war against Victoria Gable had just begun, but the war for Lily's life was reaching its breaking point. The drive back to the hospital was a blur of neon signs and hollow hope. Every red light felt like a personal insult. Every second spent idling was a second I wasn't by Lily's side. When I finally sprinted through the ICU doors, the silence hit me like a physical weight. It was the kind of silence that only exists in places where life hangs by a microscopic thread. I found Sarah sitting in a hard plastic chair, her head in her hands. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. When she looked up, her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "Where is he? Where's Dr. Hayes?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Before she could answer, the double doors swung open. Dr. Hayes walked toward us, his face a mask of clinical exhaustion. He didn't say a word at first, and in my line of work I knew what that meant. Silence from a doctor is the same as silence from a jury. It's never good news. "Chief, Sarah, let's sit down," he said softly. "Just tell us, doctor," I replied, my hands instinctively curling into fists at my sides. He sighed, looking down at his clipboard before meeting my eyes. Lily experienced what we call severe heat-induced cardiac failure. Her heart, already fragile from the previous surgeries, was pushed far beyond its physical limits by the stress and the temperature. We've managed to stabilize her rhythm for the moment, but the damage to the cardiac muscle is extensive. Sarah let out a choked sob. "But she's going to wake up, right? She's going to be okay." Dr. Hayes hesitated, and my stomach dropped. "She is on high-level life support. Her heart is no longer capable of pumping enough blood to sustain her organs on its own. We are moving her to the top of the national transplant list immediately." "A transplant?" I felt the air leave the room. "She was just reading a book, doctor. She was fine this morning." "I know," he said, his voice hardening with a flicker of professional anger. "And if she hadn't been restrained, if she had been able to get inside when she felt the distress coming on, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Whoever did this didn't just break a rule. They stole her future." I walked to the window of the ICU and looked in at my daughter. She looked so tiny in that massive hospital bed, surrounded by a dozen different tubes and wires that were doing the work her body no longer could. She was a warrior, but even warriors have their breaking point. While I stood there, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from Elena Vargas, the district attorney. She was a woman who had a reputation for being a shark in the courtroom, but her voice on the voicemail was trembling with a mother's rage. "Rob, I've seen the evidence Vance brought in. The chains, the photos, the text messages. I want you to know something. I'm not just going for a conviction. I'm going for the maximum sentence the law allows. Victoria Gable thought she was the law in that neighborhood, but she's about to find out what happens when the real law comes home." But as I looked at Lily, I realized that even a life sentence for Victoria wouldn't fix the hole in my daughter's heart. The community was starting to wake up, though. My inbox was flooding with messages from other neighbors. Now that the queen of the HOA was behind bars, the stories were pouring out like a broken dam. One mother told me Victoria had tried to fine her because her autistic son hummed too loudly on the sidewalk. Another man said she had threatened to tow his car while he was unloading groceries for his elderly, disabled mother. Victoria hadn't just targeted Lily. She had been a predator in a Pearl Zan picket fence disguise for years. I turned back to the room looking at my wife. "She's not getting away with this, Sarah, not a single second of it." "I don't care about her, Rob," Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on Lily. "I just want our daughter back." I nodded, but in the back of my mind, a dark, cold fire was burning. Victoria Gable had wanted to teach us a lesson about rules. Now I was going to teach her a lesson about consequences. The third night in the ICU is always the hardest. It's when the initial adrenaline of the crisis fades, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the machines. The hospital was silent, save for the rhythmic hiss-click of Lily's ventilator. I sat in the corner of the room, my badge resting on the bedside table, a reminder of a world that felt a million miles away. Dr. Hayes had warned us that this was the critical window. For 3 days, Lily had been under, her body fighting a war on 2 fronts, the damage from the heat and the trauma of the cardiac failure. Suddenly, the tone of the monitor changed. It wasn't an alarm, but a shift in rhythm. Lily's eyes fluttered. They were unfocused at first, darting around the sterile room until they landed on me. "Daddy," she whispered, the word barely a breath behind the plastic of her oxygen mask. I was at her side in a heartbeat, grabbing her hand. It felt as light as a bird's wing. "I'm here, sweetheart, I'm right here." Her eyes filled with tears that tracked slowly down her pale cheeks. "Did I break a rule? The lady, she said I was bad." Those words shattered me more than the sight of the chains ever could. In her moments of greatest pain, my daughter wasn't thinking about her heart. She was wondering if she deserved what had happened to her. "No, Angel," I said, my voice thick with a father's grief. "You did nothing wrong, she did." "My heart hurts, Daddy," she whispered, "so much." I stayed with her until she drifted back into a fitful sleep. When I stepped out into the hall to splash water on my face, I found Captain Vance waiting for me. He didn't look like a man bringing good news. "Chief, we've got a problem," Vance said, handing me a tablet. "Victoria Gable's lawyer, a shark named Marcus Collins, just went on the local news." I watched the video. Collins stood in front of the courthouse, looking smug in a $3,000 suit. "This is a classic case of overreach," he told the cameras. "My client was merely attempting to secure a child she believed was abandoned. The medical condition is being used by the police chief to satisfy a personal vendetta. If anyone is at fault, it is the parents for leaving a medically fragile child unsupervised in the heat." I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice. He was turning the victim into the villain. He was blaming Sarah for a 10-minute phone call while his client was carrying industrial chains in her purse. "He's trying to poison the jury pool before we even get to discovery," Vance muttered. "Let him try," I said, my voice dropping to a level that made Vance take a half step back. "Because while he's talking to cameras, we're talking to the neighbors. He thinks this is about rules and liability." I'm going to make sure the world knows this was about a woman who enjoyed watching a child suffer. Later that night, Dr. Hayes pulled Sarah and me aside. His face was grave. "The window is closing," he said. "Lily has moved into end-stage failure. The damage from the restraint and the heat trauma is irreversible." "How long?" Sarah whispered. "Months, maybe less. We need a donor heart and we need it soon." I walked back into Lily's room and looked at the heart monitor, the very thing Victoria Gable had called a prop for attention. Every beep was a ticking clock. Victoria Gable wanted to teach us a lesson about her power. She had no idea that she hadn't just attacked a child. She had declared war on a father who had nothing left to lose. The trial was set to begin in 8 weeks. It wouldn't just be a trial for Victoria. It would be a reckoning for every bully who ever thought a title gave them the right to be a monster. The trial began 8 weeks later, but the atmosphere in the courthouse felt like a funeral. The hallways were packed, not just with journalists, but with the families Victoria Gable had terrorized for years. Emma was home by then, but she wasn't the same little girl who loved to run. She was weak, tethered to an oxygen tank at night, unable to walk more than a few steps without her heart monitor screaming its rhythmic warning. She couldn't testify, her heart simply couldn't handle the stress. But as I sat behind the prosecution table, watching Victoria walk in with her head held high, I knew Emma didn't need to speak. The evidence would scream for her. Victoria sat at the defense table looking irritated, smoothing her designer suit as if the entire proceeding was a minor inconvenience to her social calendar. Her lawyer, Marcus Collins, began his opening statement with a chilling strategy. He blamed the victim. He argued that the medically fragile state of the child was a pre-existing condition and that his client had no way of knowing the seriousness of the situation. Then District Attorney Elena Vargas stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. An 8-year-old heart patient was chained to a porch in 95-degree heat and left to die, she began, her voice echoing in the silent room. The defendant knew she was sick. She saw the heart monitor, and she still walked away. Elena held up 2 photos. The first was Emma 3 months ago, smiling, holding a book, the sun catching the gold in her hair. The second was Emma in the ICU, pale, intubated with tubes snaking out of her tiny body like vines. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Then came the moment that broke the defense back. "We've heard the defense claim that Mrs. Gable acted out of a misunderstanding," Elena said, turning to the jury. But Mrs. Lynn's doorbell camera caught more than just the incident. It caught the dialogue. The video flickered to life on the large monitors. The courtroom watched in horror as Victoria approached Emma. We heard Emma's small, trembling voice explaining her heart condition. We heard the rhythmic beep, beep, beep of her monitor increasing in tempo as her panic rose. And then we heard Victoria's response. "I don't care about your little toy, you brat." Victoria's voice rang out on the recording, sharp and cruel. "Stop pretending to be sick. You're an eyesore. If your parents won't keep you inside, this chain will." The jury watched as Victoria pulled the heavy industrial chain from her bag, proving it was brought from home with intent. They watched as she padlocked a crying, gasping child to a railing and walked away without a single backward glance. But Elena wasn't done. She produced the final nail in the coffin, the text message Victoria had sent to the HOA Vice President. "Finally going to teach the Ramirez family a lesson," Elena read aloud. "Their sick kid needs to learn she's not special." The courtroom erupted. The judge had to pound her gavel for nearly a minute to restore order. Even Marcus Collins looked down at his legal pad, unable to meet the jury's eyes. Then it was Jessica's turn. My wife walked to the stand, her face a mask of quiet agony. "She was just reading," Jessica whispered, the tears finally breaking through. "Just reading her book like she always does, and this woman decided that her life was worth less than a neighborhood rule." I looked at Victoria. For the first time, the smugness was gone. She wasn't looking at the jury, she was looking at the floor. She finally realized that the lesson she tried to teach us had become her own undoing. The air in the courtroom felt thick, like the moments before a massive thunderstorm. The jury had been out for only 2 hours, an impossibly short time for a trial of this magnitude. In my experience, a fast jury usually means one of two things. They are hopelessly deadlocked, or they saw the truth clearly within the first 10 minutes. As the 12 men and women filed back into the jury box, I scanned their faces. Not one of them would look at Diana Harrington. They kept their eyes fixed on the floor or on the judge. Diana, however, was still sitting tall, a faint, defiant sneer playing on her lips, as if she still believed her HOA title gave her immunity from the laws of humanity. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Sterling asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied. The room went so silent, I could hear the mechanical ticking of the clock on the back wall. Every heartbeat felt like a drum. On the count of unlawful restraint of a minor, we find the defendant, Diana Harrington, guilty. A small gasp escaped from the gallery. On the count of aggravated child endangerment, guilty. Diana's sneer faltered. Her hands began to twitch on the table. On the count of civil rights violations and premeditated assault, guilty. Then came the big one, the charge that Marcus Collins had fought so hard to dismiss. On the count of attempted murder in the second degree, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom didn't erupt. It exhaled. It was the sound of 100 people finally letting go of the breath they had been holding since that scorching afternoon in July. Diana collapsed into her chair, her face turning a sickly shade of gray, the same color my daughter's lips had been when I found her chained to that porch. The judge didn't wait for a sentencing hearing. She looked directly at Diana, her eyes like cold flint. "Mrs. Harrington, you spoke often of rules and standards. You treated a residential neighborhood like your own personal fiefdom, and you treated a sick child like an inconvenience. You saw a heart monitor, and you saw fit to ignore the sanctity of life for the sake of an aesthetic. This court finds no mercy for those who show none to the innocent." "Life in prison," the judge declared, her gavel hitting the wood with a finality that sounded like a tomb door closing. "Without the possibility of parole." As the bailiffs moved in to lead her away, Diana finally looked at me. For the first time I saw it, the fear. The realization that she was no longer the queen of the suburbs. She was just a number in a system she couldn't control. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I simply touched the badge on my belt and looked her in the eye until she was forced to look away. Justice had been served in a court of law, but the battle at home was far from over. I drove back to the hospital, the sunset painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. I walked into Emma's room. She was awake, sitting up slightly, watching a cartoon with the sound turned low. She looked so small, but when she saw me, her eyes lit up. "Daddy, is the lady gone?" she asked. I sat on the edge of her bed and kissed her forehead. "She's gone, baby. She's never coming back. You're safe now." We are still waiting for that donor heart. Some days are harder than others. Some days the monitor alarms still go off and my heart stops along with hers. But Emma is a fighter. She knows she did nothing wrong. She knows her father will move mountains to keep her safe. Diana Harrington tried to break a little girl to prove a point about power. Instead, she learned that there is no power on earth greater than a father's love and the cold, unyielding reach of the law. All right, real talk. If you were in my shoes, standing in that driveway with your daughter's life on the line, what would you have said to an HOA Karen like Diana? Or better yet, do you have your own HOA horror story that needs to be told? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you believe bullies like Diana deserve exactly what they get.